US authorities are working to deal with the tens of thousands of people in migration centres. Migrants who rushed to cross the border from Mexico and into the US say they felt it was their last chance before a pandemic-era policy called Title 42 expired last week. Let's bring in Professor Simon Jackman, a US expert, political scientist at the University of Sydney. Thank you, Professor Jackman, as always. It's a precarious situation for the Biden administration to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely, Kieran. Immigration and border security more broadly, one of those issues that resonates deeply emotionally for many voters, speaks to the sense of a lack of control that the nation's borders aren't secure. And it's a politics that we know well in Australia, although at a far lesser scale than these numbers that have been coming across the US border. Look, Kieran, it looks like that big wave of border crossings that occurred just as Title 42 expired has waned a little bit. And the Biden administration, I think, mindful of the diabolical politics around this issue, has gone short of the powers it had under Title 42, is doing its best to process these huge numbers of people and get them back into Mexico as swiftly as it can, at numbers, Kieran, that are just mind-boggling for Australian ears to hear. A small day over the weekend was 6,000 people detained by US border authorities, down from 11,000 on the Friday as Title 42 expired.
Yeah, it's very much that human story. On the one hand, you see families and mothers and kids. It's heart-wrenching stuff. And then we consider the political implications of this into 2024, the presidential year, and those political implications are huge too.
Yeah, Kieran, right now, immigration, in response to the facts on the ground, has ticked up as the most important problem confronting the United States. I was just reviewing some polling data ahead of our chat, Kieran, and immigration is now about the number 3 most important issue. People put a whole bunch of economic issues into a bucket, so you put that one there. Healthcare, immigration coming in at number 3. And of course, for Republican voters, it's way up there. About 1/3 of Republican voters will nominate border issues, immigration, as their most important problem. Democrats, it's only about 7%. And of course, this was a great issue for Donald Trump. And it's no accident that he went very hard at this issue in his CNN interview last week. He's pointing to the successes, he claims, through his very tough border policy, building the wall and what have you, and indeed Title 42 itself, a Trump-era initiative. So as we head into the presidential election cycle, Kieran, expect to hear more of this, particularly as we look at a contested Republican primary nomination. Who can be the most hairy-chested, if you will, on this issue will say a lot about who ends up being the Republican nominee for president.
Well, yeah, on that point, I was talking to one of your colleagues and analyst in the think tank community who was saying to me, don't just assume who the front runner is now will be the front runner and will be the candidate. I mean, as much as it looks most likely that it will be Trump and Biden, he says both the incumbent and Trump have huge risks facing them from a range of areas.
Look, Ron DeSantis is the name we talk about most frequently on the Republican side, is edging ever closer to announcing. He was in Iowa this last weekend in the United States. Donald Trump cancelled a number of his appearances in Iowa at the very last moment. People inside the Republican Party, as we've talked about so many times, Kieran, would love if someone other than Donald Trump was their nominee, because general election polling in the main tends to suggest that if we see a rerun of a Biden-Trump contest, too much of middle America says we're not doing that again and would prefer an 80-plus-year-old Joe Biden to be president. And on the Democratic side, of course, I think the single biggest issue is probably Biden's health and issues about is he up for a second term. That question just, I think, as someone who even likes Joe Biden can't help but have that question. You've got to have that question. I think it'd be politically irresponsible not for Democrats not to entertain a question of a what if And so I agree with you, Kieran. I think there are easy to see scenarios on both sides where, despite huge poll leads, where are we? May of 23, we're a good 7-8 months before the first primaries and caucuses are held. That's a long time in politics, of course.
Yeah, it's an eternity, isn't it? Simon, great to get your insights as always.